Alrighty, there are riots in Liverpool, England, and people are speculating that these riots may spread across the country. Now, what triggered the Liverpool uprising? Um, well, the match that kicked off the Blazing Inferno, which I think actually only involved in one police car being burnt. I don't think they actually burned down the city, like BLM style. So these Brits, they don't really know how to riot like us Americans. We should send them some BLM organizers over there. Although I guess they wouldn't want to train the far right protesters on how to properly riot. But I mean, as we learned in the summer of 2020, when you actually burn the city to the ground, you get results pretty quickly. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. What seems to have triggered and kicked off this round of protests over the last night or the night before, I think it was the night before actually, although maybe it continued into last night. I should double check that. Was a 15-year-old girl who posted a video online, probably TikTok or something, of a migrant in his mid-20s propositioning her. Let's put it that way. That's the YouTube-friendly way of putting it. So what we have here is a young man, mid-20s. I mean, he's not super young, but he's still in the prime of his life. And he's probably been traveling for a long time, coming from wherever it is he came from, Libya. Let's assume maybe he came from Libya. He had to cross the Mediterranean on a boat. That's not fun. If you think it sucks crossing the Florida Straits, trying to land in Miami or something like that, coming from Cuba, I think crossing the Mediterranean probably worse. I'm not a geologist or a geographer, but just looking on a map, I know Mercator projection, it can sometimes distort things. I think there's a bigger distance between, what is it, the southern tip of Italy? Is it Calabria? Between Calabria and Libya. I think that's a big body of water you got to cross. So think about it. This guy had to go across probably on a boat. He had to land in Italy, and then presumably he got a free train pass from the government to ride a train all the way from Italy to Calais in France. Probably spent a few months maybe in the Calais jungle. Pretty sure the jungle still exists. About 7-8 years ago, I remember hearing a lot about the Calais jungle. That's where all of the so-called Syrian refugees lived, which mostly were not Syrian, and it was a pretty crazy place. Maybe people from South Florida remember when they had the Cubans living under the bridges in those camps in the 80s. If you've seen Scarface, it's depicted. From what I understand, Calais was much, much worse. And so this 25-year-old guy probably got tired of living in the jungle, and he hopped on a raft. Maybe he put his floaties on and doggy paddled across the English Channel and landed in England, where he is now being housed at some hotel in Liverpool for free. So he's been on this long journey. He finally makes it to Liverpool, and after all this time, there's probably something that he misses, and that is the love and affection of a lovely lady. Now, like most migrants, he is a military-aged male, single, no kids that we know of, and certainly no wife. And so what's a man to do in his situation other than sample the local hose? I mean, that's what we all do when we're in a new country, right? The first thing we do is we seek out a prostitute. Now, where this man comes from, I'm sure he comes from a very pious community, and I'm sure that he prays 5 times a day, just like he's supposed to. I'm sure he never misses that. I'm sure he doesn't engage in heathenistic indulgences like alcohol. And a part of his very pious and modest religious background, he knows that women never walk around a city unattended by a male family member unless they're a streetwalker. And even though he is a very pious man with very good manners, who would never disrespect a lady, um, a streetwalker that disrespects herself, uh, he can make an exception for. And so he witnessed this young girl walking the streets by herself, presumably trolling for Johns, so he would think, because she's not attended by a male family member, and so that she's obviously not just some normal girl. And he propositions her, as you would any hoe that you find in the street. And much to his surprise, I would imagine, she was not interested. Now, all we have here are it's a simple understanding as a result of cultural differences. And so I think that's what these far-right rioters in Liverpool just don't understand. They don't understand that when they send their daughters out of the house, unattended, maybe down to the convenience store or walking to school, your average migrant, all he's going to see is a hoe. And that's not his fault. That's your fault for being ignorant. And so, in order to make up for this misunderstanding, you should hand your daughter over to the migrant and allow him to have his way with her until he is finished, as a sort of gesture of good hospitality. And that's what the left-wing counter-protesters were trying to convey to the far-right rioters, the very bad, no-good people of Liverpool who take offense at grown men trying to pick up teen girls. Now, I seem to remember another story about a man giving up his daughters to be used as the plaything of transient men. It's a very old story, but the ending has always stuck with me. Some of you might remember it. It ended with God obliterating two cities in what can only be described in modern language as a nuclear holocaust. Now, maybe I'm being unfair here. The modern United Kingdom is probably much more degenerate than Sodom and Gomorrah ever were, so I don't think it's really fair to compare them. Obviously, God has been sleeping on the job, or else all of Great Britain, along with Western Europe and most of the United States, would have been wiped out probably sometime in the last 5 years. But then again, who am I to question God's methods? Now, in all seriousness, this really is a problem for Great Britain. There is a minority of people in that country who seem to care about anything. But as small as they are in numbers, I would say probably no more than 40% of the country, they are growing in intensity. As things continue to get worse and worse in Great Britain, this loud plurality, loud minority, whatever you want to call them, they're going to continue agitating for change. And that's a good thing. I don't know if Britain is salvageable. I could hope it is. But obviously, this uprising in Liverpool was not caused by just a single migrant speaking out of turn to a young lady. This has been building for decades. And what this says to me is that the supreme tolerance and self-hatred of the British people is wearing thin. For decades, the British have been told that they are bad, fundamentally, that they have white privilege, and they have felt very guilty about that. They have been wrought with white guilt for decades. And because of that guilt, they have been willing to tolerate an erosion of what once was a very cohesive society, because to them it felt like a form of reparations for the rest of the world. So all in all, I wish them well, but when I look at their leadership, when you've got a competition between Rishi Sunak, who I guess at the very least he was able to correctly define a woman when asked by Piers Morgan, um, and you've got him juxtaposed to Keir Starmer, and Keir Starmer is probably going to be prime minister after the next election. These are both open borders candidates, leading open borders parties that will continue to implement open borders policies, while at the same time they are completely in bed with the global economic elite. I believe Rishi Sunak, I think he worked for Goldman, if I remember correctly. And then you've got over in France Macron, who was a Rothschild, not a member of their family, an employee at the bank. So I forget how high up he was at Rothschild's. I wonder what Keir Starmer's background is. I know that unlike, a lot of labor politicians back in the day, he certainly doesn't have a background in organized labor. I don't think he's ever had to work for a living in his life. I think that he just probably went to college and went into some think tank or something and then became a politician somehow. But I should double check that. Anyway, my point is that there is no one in British politics with any amount of influence who gives a damn or can even comprehend the angst felt by these people. They have absolutely zero sympathy from Keir Starmer or Rishi Sunak. There is always Nigel Farage, but again, Nigel Farage appeals to this base of people. He's never appealed to a massive percentage of the British public. Although, now that I think about it, since Britain does have they don't have proportional representation, so never mind. I mean, that was always the problem with UKIP, was that they would get a certain percentage, a low percentage, but across the entire country. And if they had proportional representation, UKIP would have had a lot of seats back in the day when Nigel Farage was in charge. And he's moved on. I forget what the party thing is that he's a part of now. Came out of the Brexit party. Anyway, it doesn't matter because they don't have proportional representation there. It's just like it is here in the U.S. You got to get the most votes in that district, which that has its merits too. When you have a lot of regional differences, but in Great Britain, the dissenters against all this are in a minority everywhere, pretty much. And so they make up a substantial portion of the population. They're just not concentrated anywhere. So anyway, despite this uprising, I fear that it is just a flash in the pan, because just structurally, I don't see anything that looks particularly good for Britain. With that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow. Or no, I won't see you folks back here tomorrow because I'm going to be out of town early this week. So I will see you folks back here on Thursday.